Why the avoidant gets triggered the most when the empath finally stops talking. Have you ever noticed that the moment you finally pull back, the person who kept withdrawing suddenly panics? It's almost like your silence becomes louder than all the conversations they ran from. We don't often talk about this dynamic, but it's one so many people live through. Why does the avoidant get the most triggered when the empath finally stops talking? At first, the empath is the one doing the emotional heavy lifting, explaining, reaching out, smoothing over misunderstandings, making sure the connection feels safe. They talk because they love. They talk because clarity matters to them. They talk because communication is intimacy. Meanwhile, the avoidant keeps a comfortable distance. They pull back when things feel too close. They shut down when the conversation gets too real. They think space will solve the discomfort they feel inside. But then something happens. The empath, who has been understanding, patient, and emotionally open, finally hits a point where their nervous system says enough. Not in anger, not in manipulation, just a quiet, exhausted truth. I can't keep carrying this alone. And when the empath finally stops talking, the avoidant feels something they didn't expect, a sudden, sharp loss of control. Because here's the secret. Avoidants aren't indifferent, they're overwhelmed. And as long as the empath keeps talking, they can rely on the certainty that the connection is still there. The empath's words act as a tether, gentle, consistent, reassuring. But silence? Silence is unpredictable. Silence forces them into the one territory they avoid most, their own feelings. When the empath goes quiet, the avoidant is left alone with their own fears. What if they're actually done with me? What if I push too far? What if I lose them? What if I wasn't as in control as I thought? Your silence confronts them with the reality that connection is not a guaranteed resource, that affection doesn't flow forever without reciprocity, that even the most giving person eventually needs to feel held, heard, and chosen too. Ironically, it's the empath's absence, not their presence, that finally exposes the avoidance attachment wounds. And here's the empowering truth. You're not triggering them because you're punishing them. You're triggering them because you've removed the emotional labor that kept the relationship afloat. You've stopped being the emotional cushion. Your silence says, your fear isn't my responsibility to protect anymore. My peace matters too. If you want connection, you have to meet me halfway. And in that moment, the dynamic shifts. Not because the empath played a game, but because they finally honored their worth. Avoidants often seem detached, uninterested, or unbothered on the surface, but the truth is far more complex. They actually rely heavily on the empath's consistent communication, just not in a way that's obvious. For an avoidant, emotional closeness can feel overwhelming, even threatening. Opening up feels risky, and vulnerability can activate old fears of being judged, controlled, or rejected. So instead of leaning in, they instinctively pull back. But while they pull away physically or emotionally, they still depend on the empath's steady flow of reassurance to feel connected without having to confront the discomfort of closeness. The empath becomes the emotional engine of the relationship. The one who checks in, clarifies misunderstandings, brings issues to the surface, offers comfort, and naturally bridges any gaps created by distance. This consistency allows the avoidant to maintain a sense of connection on their own terms. Connection without confrontation, intimacy without exposure. They get to benefit from closeness without being the one to take emotional risks. As long as the empath keeps talking, the avoidant doesn't have to stretch themselves, initiate repair, or examine their own behavior. The empath's presence cushions them from the consequences of withdrawal. This creates an unspoken dynamic where the empath becomes responsible for the relationship's emotional stability. Their communication becomes the glue holding things together, even when the avoidant steps back. It gives the avoidant a sense of control because they don't need to move toward the relationship moves toward them. The empath provides the reassurance that connection still exists, even when the avoidant isn't actively nurturing it. For the avoidant, this feels safe, predictable, manageable. But beneath that calm surface is a quiet dependence, a reliance on the empath to keep showing up emotionally so the avoidant never has to face the discomfort of doing so themselves. The avoidant may not consciously recognize this reliance, but it's there. The expectation that communication will always be available, that the empath will always explain, always initiate, always soothe, always give grace. The avoidant becomes accustomed to this emotional safety net. This is why the empath's silence can feel like losing oxygen, not because the avoidant wants endless conversations, but because they've built a sense of emotional security around the empath's presence. When communication stops, that safety net disappears. The avoidant suddenly realizes how much they depended on the empath's steady emotional availability to maintain the connection without having to fully participate in it. The silence exposes that unspoken dependency, and that is deeply triggering for someone who has spent their life trying not to depend on anyone. When the empath finally stops talking, the avoidant is confronted with something they've been unconsciously running from, their own internal world. As long as the empath continues to communicate, the avoidant can deflect, distance, or distract themselves from emotional responsibility. The empath's words act like a buffer, softening the emotional terrain so the avoidant doesn't have to step onto it. But once that communication disappears, the avoidant is left alone with the very feelings they've tried to outrun: fear, insecurity, confusion, and the discomfort of not knowing what comes next. Avoidants aren't immune to emotion, they're overwhelmed by it. They learned at some point that closeness brings pressure, expectations, or instability, so they developed a protective reflex: step back before you get hurt. But that reflex only works when the other person continues to close the gap. When the empath stops doing the emotional pursuing, that protective strategy collapses. There is no one closing in, no one explaining, no one soothing, no one ensuring safety. In that emptiness, the avoidant's internal alarms begin to activate. Silence creates a vacuum, and in that vacuum, buried fears rise to the surface. They may suddenly feel uncertain about the relationship's status. They may worry they pushed too far or misread the empath's patience. The lack of communication forces them into introspection, something deeply uncomfortable for someone whose entire attachment system is built around avoiding emotional depth. For perhaps the first time in the dynamic, the avoidant has to confront what the relationship means to them without the empath's voice guiding or cushioning the experience. Triggers often come from the unknown, and silence introduces uncertainty. The empath's sudden quiet creates a space the avoidant cannot control or predict. It forces them to sit with ambiguity, something their attachment style struggles with profoundly. Instead of managing the relationship by withdrawing, they now have to face the consequences of that withdrawal. They must reckon with the possibility that their distancing could lead to actual loss, not just theoretical loss they tell themselves they're fine with, but a real absence they can feel. In this internal confrontation, old wounds resurface. Memories of abandonment, unmet needs, or early emotional overwhelm can get activated. The avoidant may not label these sensations as fear or sadness. They might feel irritation, restlessness, defensiveness, or anxiety without knowing why. But the core reason is simple. The empath's silence has stripped away their escape routes. They can no longer avoid the very feelings they've spent so long building walls to protect themselves from. When the empath decides to stop talking, something profound happens in the dynamic. The emotional labor that has kept the relationship functioning suddenly disappears. Throughout the connection, the empath is usually the one who feels the emotional temperature, notices small shifts, and steps in to repair or clarify. They're the one who brings up concerns gently, asks how the other person is feeling, or reassures them during moments of tension. This constant caretaking fills in the gaps left by the avoidance withdrawal, preventing the relationship from collapsing under the weight of unspoken issues. Over time, this becomes so normal that both people unconsciously operate as if the empath's effort is simply part of the relationship's structure. But the empath's work isn't invisible, it's just taken for granted. The avoidant gets used to being emotionally buffered without having to be equally involved. They learn on a deep level that someone else will handle the discomfort, the misunderstandings, and the vulnerability. The empath becomes the safety net that prevents emotional freefall. Even if the avoidant doesn't express it, they depend on that cushion, to avoid confronting their own emotional limitations. It allows them to maintain a sense of emotional distance without suffering the consequences of that distance. Once the empath stops talking, that invisible labor is suddenly gone. The avoidant, who has relied on the empath to maintain a feeling of stability, is confronted with the reality that the relationship cannot sustain itself on silence. The absence of the empath's effort reveals just how much weight the empath was carrying. What used to feel like a balanced or manageable dynamic now feels unpredictable, fragile, and exposed. The avoidant may not fully understand why they feel off balance, but they can feel the emotional structure shifting beneath them. With the empath no longer doing the work of soothing, explaining, checking in, or repairing, the avoidant is left with responsibilities they've never practiced handling. The emotional slack that was once pulled tight by the empath now hangs loose, and the avoidant is confronted with the gaps their distance created. This can be deeply uncomfortable because it highlights a truth they've avoided seeing. Sustaining connection requires contribution from both sides. In that moment, the avoidant realizes that the relationship was never effortless. It only looked effortless because someone else was putting in the effort. The silence doesn't just remove communication, it removes the emotional scaffolding that once allowed the avoidant to remain distant without losing the connection. Without the empath's labor holding the dynamic together, the imbalance becomes impossible to ignore, and the avoidant is forced to face the uncomfortable reality that their withdrawal has consequences they never anticipated. When the empath goes quiet, the avoidant doesn't just notice the absence of words. They feel the absence of predictability. For someone with an avoidant attachment style, emotional control is one of their primary ways of feeling safe. They may not express it directly, but they manage their relationships by creating distance when things feel too intense and re-engaging only when it feels comfortable. This rhythm gives them a sense of stability. As long as the empath keeps reaching out, reassuring, or clarifying, the avoidant can maintain this sense of control because the empath's communication provides a reliable emotional anchor. The avoidant knows what to expect. No matter how much they pull back, the empath will keep showing up. But when the empath stops talking, that predictability disappears in an instant. Silence introduces a level of uncertainty that the avoidant isn't equipped to handle. Suddenly, they're not sure where the relationship stands. They don't know what the empath is thinking, whether they're upset or whether the connection is slipping away. This unknown triggers something deep within them, not because they crave constant closeness, but because they fear the instability that comes with not knowing what's happening. Avoidants often appear calm, detached, or unconcerned on the surface, yet internally they can feel highly activated when they lose a sense of control. The silence feels different from distance. Distance is something the avoidant chooses. Silence is something that happens to them. It's a shift from managing the relationship to realizing they may no longer be in a position to predict or influence what comes next. For someone who is used to withdrawing to regulate their emotions, this reversal is unsettling. They begin to feel the same uncertainty the empath has felt many times before, but they don't have the emotional tools to navigate it. Without the empath filling in the blanks, the avoidant's mind is left to guess, and guessing leads to fear. The fear isn't always loud. Sometimes it shows up as irritation, overthinking, or suddenly becoming hyper-aware of the empath's absence. They may even tell themselves they don't care, but their body reacts anyway. Restlessness, tightness in the chest, racing thoughts, or a sudden urge to re-establish control by checking in or pulling the empath back into the dynamic. Silence creates a sense of potential loss, and because avoidants are used to controlling closeness by withdrawing, the idea of losing someone through their own behavior becomes confusing and destabilizing. The unpredictability of silence exposes their vulnerability. It forces them to see that their distance didn't stop the relationship from mattering. It only stopped them from feeling prepared for the moment the other person finally lets go. When the empath finally stops talking, it's not an attempt to manipulate the avoidant or create anxiety. It's a boundary formed out of emotional exhaustion. The empath's silence isn't crafted as a tactic. It emerges naturally when they no longer have the energy to over-explain, overgive, or cushion the emotional distance the avoidant creates. This is important because avoidants often interpret any change in communication as a threat or a test. But in reality, the empath's decision to pull back is rooted in self-preservation, not strategy. It's the moment they stop carrying a weight that was never meant to be carried alone. What makes this so triggering for the avoidant is that the dynamic shifts from unconscious reliance on the empath's emotional labor to a space where the avoidant must take responsibility for their own participation. As long as the empath continues talking, comforting, and making sense of the relationship, the avoidant can remain passive, distant, or even oblivious to the imbalance. But when that energy stops, the truth becomes clear. Connection requires action from both sides. The empath's silence reveals that the avoidant's withdrawal has consequences not because the empath is punishing them, but because no relationship can survive one person doing all the emotional work. The boundary the empath sets, intentionally or unintentionally, forces the avoidant into a place they've worked hard to avoid, emotional accountability. Without the empath initiating every repair, the avoidant must decide whether the relationship matters enough to step forward. And this decision activates all the fears they've kept hidden beneath their calm exterior. They may feel exposed, pressured, or confused as to why the dynamic doesn't feel the same. They may wonder why the empath is suddenly different, not realizing that the change didn't come from a desire to control, but from a desire to stop feeling alone. This moment often becomes a turning point. The avoidant faces a truth they've long tried to sidestep. Avoidance doesn't prevent pain, it only delays it. And the empath realizes that withdrawing isn't about abandoning the relationship, but honoring their emotional capacity. The avoidance trigger is tied to the fact that for the first time, they are being asked to meet the empath at the same level. The silence shows them that if they want connection, they must contribute to it. The empath's boundary becomes a mirror, reflecting back the dynamic as it truly is. It highlights the imbalance not through anger, but through absence. It invites the avoidant to step into emotional reciprocity, not because they being forced, but because the relationship cannot continue if they don't. When we look at this dynamic from a place of compassion rather than blame, something important becomes clear. Neither the empath nor the avoidant is inherently the problem. Both are responding to old patterns, old fears, and old versions of themselves they haven't yet outgrown. The empath is used to giving, soothing, and understanding because that's how they've learned to feel valued. The avoidant is used to pulling back, protecting, and minimizing vulnerability because that's how they've learned to feel safe. But when the empath finally stops talking, when they stop carrying the emotional weight alone, it forces both people to face the truth of the connection. The avoidant is confronted with the realization that silence is not an attack, it's a boundary. And the empath learns that stepping back is not abandonment, it's self-respect. In that shift, there is an opportunity, an invitation for both individuals to grow, to communicate authentically, and to meet each other in a healthier space. Sometimes that leads to healing together. Sometimes it leads to parting with clarity, but either way, it leads to truth. And in relationships, truth is what ultimately frees us. If you're the empath, your silence is not a weapon. It's a moment of reclaiming your emotional energy. If you're the avoidant, your discomfort is not failure. It's a sign that something in you is ready to heal. And when both people become aware of the patterns they've been repeating, they can finally choose something different, something honest, reciprocal, and grounded in mutual care. Thank you for listening. Thank you for reflecting. And thank you for caring enough about your relationships and yourself to explore this with an open heart. I appreciate your time, your presence, and your willingness to grow. Take care, and until next time, thank you.